Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session, uh, the student course session and session year consultation. Next slide. Okay. So today we have Ruth Underwood and Rachel Wicks. Basically, Ruth is going to be doing the full session. But if at any point there seems to be a glitch or any issues, Rachel would then step in. Okay. Also, just to introduce a couple of people in the room, we have Alan Steptoe from OFS. We also have Anna Falvey from HFQ. We have Rachel Clifford from HFQ. We have Gordon Anderson from SFC. And we have Michael McNeil, TFE. Okay? They're all in the room and their cameras are currently on. Okay? Next slide. All right, just to let you know that this session would be recorded and the recording will be available for 6 weeks. Now, regarding Q&A, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. So if you look on your laptop, there would be like a raise hand icon. So if you just want to use that, no, I don't mean like do this, but if you want to use the raise hand icon, just if you have questions. Alternatively, you can use the text box as much as possible. Please try to use the text box as we're quite a number of people in the room today. So please try to use the text box where possible and your questions will be answered. So while Ruth is delivering, Rachel would be in the text box looking out for questions and answering as much questions as possible. If we do not have the answers to all your questions today, we would send out a Q&A document at the end of the session that would cover everything that you've asked today. Okay, we're going to try and make this as interactive as possible. So please just engage when necessary and when asked any questions where possible. Now, something to make note of is if you look at the top bar of your screen, you would see a chat box and you see a Q&A box. Now, use the chat box to respond to questions that's been asked by the presenter. And use the Q&A box to respond to ask your questions. And this is because we want to be able to separate response to questions that's asked and questions that you have to ask, basically. So please make use of the Q&A for questions and the chat for anything in general, okay? Sometimes you might not be able to access the Q&A box, so you can feel free to use the chat, it's fine. But if you can access the Q&A, it's just easier and simple for us to know the difference between the question and just the response, okay? At the end of the session, we would have a feedback process, and then you'll be able to, like give us a feedback generally of how you enjoyed today's session, and that should be fine. One thing to also make note of is if you have any technical issues, please email training@hisa.ac.uk and myself or one of my colleagues will pick up your query, okay? If at any point you're having any tech issues, feel free to leave a chat as well and just let us know that you'll be back where possible, okay? And anything in general that's related to training to this session and that's an issue, please just drop us an email and that should be fine, okay? And now I would now be passing over to my colleague, Ruth. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. So as Chris said, I'm Ruth Underwood. I'm a product owner at DISC, and I'm going to be taking you through most of this session. Just firstly, a quick apology. I am having some connection issues, which is why my video is off, and Rachel and Chris are going to let me know if I become unbearably robotic. Hopefully we'll be okay. So as Chris said, the purpose of this session is to take you through an overview of the consultation that we've published, focused on student course sessions and session years within the student record. Goal of today, hopefully you'll go away understanding what the proposals are that we're making, why those are being proposed, and the feedback that we're after. So to do that, I'm going to start with a bit of kind of high-level background on where this consultation has come from, and go through each of the proposals in turn and give more specific context on why they're being proposed, and then what feedback we're interested in on each of those proposals. I am going to pause after each proposal, and Rachel's going to very kindly be monitoring the questions for me and see if we've had any questions on those specific proposals. So please do pop anything in the chat or Q&A box, and we'll answer as many as we can. So, like I said, I'll kick off with a little bit of general background on how we kind of got to this consultation. You'll be aware that we developed a new data model for the 22056 collection. As part of developing that model, we identified a requirement to submit data to kind of year-long periods of time for consistency between providers and also for the definitions of certain concepts. So, for example, definition of mode or completion, a lot of these are tied to year-long periods of study. And that was the requirement that the student course sessions were aiming to fill. So they were allowed to record a year of activity. Sorry, I'm seeing some messages. It might sound really bad.
Yeah, Ruth, it's got worse actually from the tech chat just now. Do you want to just restart your computer and come back, and I'll carry on from here?
Thank you very much.
And you can take that when you get back.
I will be back shortly, hopefully.
Right, did that work?
Yeah, that's fine.
Can you see that?
Yeah, we can.
Perfect. Skip forward. Sorry, everyone. It's always good to do tech checks and then it doesn't help. So I'm sure she'll be right back. So yeah, so where she got to in terms of why we've got student course session and session year. So yeah, we have that in the model to kind of help with understanding some kind of consistency in the model. So there are concepts in the model such as the FTE or stu load and mode that kind of need a set period of time in order to work. And so the concept of session year and student course session was kind of created out of that to give that consistent bucket of time. We know that's not how all courses work. It was just trying to give some type of consistency and give a bit more flexibility in terms of allowing those years to kind of start at different times to better reflect the fact that not everyone starts in the 1st of August, which was the start of our reporting period. So that's where it kind of started with. It's kind of trying to represent the years of activity that a student is doing. So as I've said, we know that's not exactly how everyone works, but trying to bring some kind of consistency in terms of the reporting of the data. There are some scenarios where student course sessions might be shorter than a year, and so the session year entity is trying to give us that context in terms of comparing the two. So you might be able to identify later starters better because there'll be a gap between the session year, which is the kind of expected amount of time, and the student course session, which is what the actual student was doing. So those are kind of where we've got to in terms of why we had student course session as session year. So during the collection and implementing it during 22056, we received a number of challenges from providers in terms of the difficulties that you were facing implementing that data model structure and getting that in your system and being able to then return it to us in the HDP. So as part of our post-implementation survey, something that we do every time there's a major review, and data features is a major review. So it was something that we were going to do anyway. But as part of that, we then asked questions in terms of trying to understand exactly which bits you were finding challenging. We knew there were a lot of areas, so we kind of wanted you to focus in terms of what specifically is it that we're trying to get out of this and what is difficult for providers to return. And software suppliers as well in terms of implementing that. So we've got loads of really good examples out of that. And so this consultation has taken all of that feedback and things that we'd already kind of identified ourselves and put them all together in terms of, okay, if we were going to try and solve all of these problems and difficulties people have, where does that kind of get us in terms of what we might do going forward? So that's where this consultation is based out. We said in the first post-implementation survey that we were going to do this as a second stage because we were aware there was going to be a lot of different things to look at. And statutory customers needed time to kind of work through and make sure that their requirements were all going to be satisfied by the this new proposal that we've got to. So that gets us to the kind of 4 proposal areas in this consultation. And we're after your feedback in terms of how you're going to find that and whether you think this is going to be a better approach than the one we've got at the moment. And then based on that, we will do our usual of reviewing all the consultation responses, coming back, having discussions with statutory customers, and then trying to make some decisions in terms of the model going forward. I will say at this point, I'm not sure if this is where Ruth was going to mention it, but because of the timings for this, we've badged this as kind of 24056 changes. As you will obviously you'll be aware that if we can't make those changes for 23-04, it is way too late for that. So we are looking at the 24-25 as the earliest point that we could make this. So that's why we've renamed the kind of consultation and like this event to say 24056, in the hope that that kind of gets that message across to providers. This is not an immediate change. We'd love to have enough time to do that, but we don't have a time machine to go back in time and tell you months in advance. So that's where we've kind of got to with this. And part of our decisions with statutory customers is making sure that that is the year that we will then implement these changes. So going on to the individual proposals, and I'm going to assume if Ruth comes back that she will shout at me when she gets back. So
Rachel, I am here.
You're here.
Do
you want to try taking over?
I'll give it a go. Let me know how my sound is. Thank you very much for stepping in.
Much better.
And covering
much
the first
better, Ruth.
bit.
You're all right.
Is it better? Excellent.
Yes.
Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so proposal 1 then is removal of the session year entity. So a bit of background as to how we came to this proposal. You'll probably be aware this is the entity we received the most feedback on during the 22056 collection. I've summarised on the slides there some of the main challenges that you highlighted, and this was during the collection and through some of our post-collection work. So some of those session years being a concept that didn't relate to something that was understood or that you held internally. Returning non-standard provision was challenging. If you had courses with different start dates between years, you might not necessarily know that up front. So that was one of the examples that was highlighted as particularly challenging. Some of you having to return a large volume of session years to meet the requirements, and then some of the challenges with the quality rules. So those are some of the biggest issues that were raised during and after the collection by providers in terms of session year. So based on the kind of level of feedback that we received, what we've done is explore with statutory customers what would we need to do if session year entity were to be removed. So we didn't want to have a consultation where we just said, do you want us to remove session year? We wanted to say, if session year is removed, here are the model guidance and validation changes that would be needed to allow that. So I'm going to run through some of those now, and then if you take those into account when you're responding to the consultation as to whether that is a preferable approach to the current structure. So I'll start with the model changes. So this is the current data model and the fields that are on student course session and session year. Most of those fields are not changing because they're not related to this proposal. The proposed data model on that side on the right with the red indicating the differences. Course session year is entirely crossed out because the proposal is to remove it. That would mean that the session year ID field on student course session would no longer be required. So that would be removed. And in order to allow the removal of session year, we proposed that we would need 2 new fields, late starter and resit. So those would be the data model changes. If we have a look at the next slide, I've got a bit more information on those 2 new fields. So the late starter flag, that was one of the things that we could ascertain from the presence of a session year, the session year start date and the student course session start date. If they were different, the student course session start date was later, we could see that the student had started their course year late. As part of our discussions with statutory customers, we've identified that that is still a requirement. And so if we were to remove session year, we'd need a new field to serve that purpose. So that will be why we're proposing a late starter flag on the student course session. Similarly, we've got a flag for a partial year resit. So again, if a student did a partial year resit in the current model structure, it may be that they move cohorts. If they were in a September cohort, they might move to the January cohort, and we could see that because they changed session year. If we remove session year, again, we've identified there's still a requirement to record that information. That's to help validate short student course sessions and identify why students might be continuing past their expected end date. So another new field to be added to student course session if we go ahead with this proposal. Within the consultation, you've got draft field specifications for both of those. So you can see some draft guidance that we've created to help you respond to that. One final point on that, the SFC have confirmed that those 2 new fields are not required for providers in Scotland, so they would only be for England, Northern Ireland and Wales. So that's the data model changes we propose. In terms of the guidance changes, sorry, Rachel, could you go back one? Just on the guidance slide, thank you. As you're probably aware, SessionYear is referenced quite a lot across different guidance pages. In terms of what we've included in the consultation, we focused on we have a current guidance document on the coding manual called Student Course Session and Session Years that goes through a number of different scenarios and how they would be returned. We've drafted a new version of that, were we to remove SessionYear. And that is included within the consultation, and the student numbers line up between the two. So student 1 in the currently published guidance is same scenario as student 1 in the proposed draft guidance in the consultation. So it might be helpful if you wanted to look at them side by side, and you can see for those different scenarios how they returned in the current guidance and how we're proposing they would be returned under the new guidance. The final area then is validation changes. So naturally, we'd remove any validation that sat at the session year level, but we would then need additional validation to be added at the student course session level to kind of replace some of the validation that was at that session year point, and that we could do by comparing the student course session to the session year dates. So where we've got to is that we generally expect that a student course session start date will be within 14 days of the anniversary of the previous student course session start date, that we generally expect there to be kind of broad consistency between years of study for a student. We of course know there will be cases where that does not apply. Some of those are able to be identified through the data model. So we've got the examples on the screen there. So if a student started their course year late, for providers in England, Northern Ireland and Wales, we'd have the late starter flag. If they had a period of dormancy, we'd have a session status indicating that. If they had a partial year resit, the resit flag, again for providers in England, Northern Ireland, Wales. And if they did a preparatory course prior to their main course, we'd have the prep flag field against the student course session. So all of those could be things that we can take into account in the validation, because they might indicate that you do have student course session start dates differing between years. If none of those existed and the start dates are inconsistent between years by more than 14 days, that is when validation, we would expect that to trigger. And if that was genuine, you'd need a tolerance override for that. So we are going to need to have some validation that checks for that consistency year on year. Now that if we propose to remove session years. On the next slide, there's just 2 more points in terms of validation updates. Again, both of these were previously covered by session year validation. They're already guidance that applies to the student course session, but we'd need to change the way we validate them. So student course sessions must not be longer than a year, and student course sessions within an engagement must not overlap. So those are the 3 areas of change. If we were to remove session year, we think we would need those data model guidance and validation changes in order to do that. If you could go to the next slide, Rachel, thank you. So in terms of the feedback we're after, the general question is, do you agree with the proposal? So would you rather stick with the current structure and the current guidance, or remove session year and have those model guidance and validation updates? So we'd ask you to take all of those into account when responding to that. And across every proposal, we've also asked a question around timescales. As Rachel said, we're proposing these changes for 24056, but we're interested in your feedback on those timescales. Like Rachel said, it's too late to make significant changes for 23056, but we want to make sure we get your feedback on the proposal to do it for 24056 as well. So that is an overview of proposal 1. I'm going to pause there and see, Rachel, have we had any questions in the chat you'd like to pick up on? Yep.
Yeah, there's been a few questions. Sorry, I'm just in the middle of responding to one. We'll start with this one here. So if session year is removed, does that mean we'd have to return all the cohorts in the same way kind of postgraduate research students are doing at the minute, and therefore the student course session still has to be a year long? Yes, that is the way that we're kind of proposing this. We'd basically take out the session year entity, which is forcing that 12 months, and instead that 12 months will be enforced by the student course session. There are obviously a couple of exception cases when you're later starters or you're doing a really short course. Anyway, those exception cases would remain, but that is the kind of proposal that we're putting forward here.
Yeah, I'd suggest having a look at some of the examples in the guidance document, because they do show some cases where you would have shorter student course sessions. And what we're proposing for a very standard example is that if the student started in, say, September and finished in June, you could return September to June rather than having to do September to the following September. We're mainly looking there at the consistency for the start dates.
Thanks, Ruth. So another comment here. So the new fields that are being proposed, would we actually need these new fields if we just had what would be the equivalent session year start date sitting on the student course session instead? This person's comments is say that providers probably know when that is. So that was another option to put a date field against the student course session instead. But when we were looking at proposals, dates across the model was one of the kind of difficult points that providers mentioned elsewhere in the consultation. So we felt actually proposing a flag field sounded less burdensome based on that feedback. And it sounds like one person's agreed. I don't know if others would agree with that. But that's why we've put forward this. So yes, that is another option. And if you believe that would be better, then we welcome that in the kind of any other comments section that we've got in the consultation. But that's why, yes, that's an option, and we kind of dismissed it and tried to go what sounded like the least burdensome option for providers. Okay, another question here. Sorry, this is the one I was in the middle of responding to. So removal of session year would be welcome, but a lot of the complexity was around the new return and having to put multiple student course sessions within one reference period. And the question here is there any review of the student course session entity planned? Ruth, from my understanding, I think the answer to that is no. I think we are still keeping that on the basis of you can return that starting at any point in the year, which means you will end up with cases where there are multiple student course sessions within one reference period. So yes, so I'm afraid that requirement will still remain, in the view of us trying to be a bit more flexible in terms of, if you only have January starters, not having to force the kind of half and half year like we used to do in the legacy collection. So I'm afraid that one is at the moment not planned to be reviewed. Okay, I think those are all the questions, but there are a couple of other ones in the chat that have come up here, which I'll just flick over to the right one. So question is, are these two new fields mutually exclusive? Can there be a later start flag and a partial reset? Ruth, I think the answer to this is yes, they can be both, I think, can't there?
Yeah, they could be both if they both applied.
Cool. So that's a yes. Next question. So, this is for the OFS. So, Alan, this is coming your way. The consultation states that identifying late starters per student course session is part of the current funding model for the OFS. However, the HESIS recreation specification does not appear to refer to session year dates. So is there any further information on how the OFS are using the identification of late starters for current funding decisions? Alan, are you able to come in on that for us?
Yeah, I'm not able to provide an answer to this right now, but I am in discussion with my colleagues to get some more information on how we are using the late starter information for funding decisions. So if we can communicate that post this meeting, that would be good.
Yeah, that's cool. As we've said, we'll be publishing the answers to all of the questions because we'll probably not get around everything today. So yeah, we'll include that on there. Thank you, Alan. Next question, where have we got to? I think there are some other specific examples in terms of dates coming up. I think there's a few there that kind of all cross over in terms of particularly medic students where the start dates are not going to be exactly the same every single year because placements change or just the year that providers start their year on changes around. And I think there's a few examples that are covering that kind of scenario. And I think that is going to come up a little bit more later on in one of the other proposals, Ruth, isn't it? But we are looking at that, and we're looking at making the validation stretch enough that those things will hopefully not trigger as much for those that change around. I think it's stretched to 14 days now. Is that, if I remember that right?
Yeah, we have agreed to stretch that validation a bit. It is going to still trigger for some of the examples that we've seen from providers where there's variance by more than that. I think in discussion with statutory customers, we are going to need some validation that is looking at that consistency and making sure that it's not a complete student course session free for all. We're going to need something, and so there are going to be cases that fall outside it and need a tolerance override. But I think we're allowing that 14 days to cover some cases.
So I think that now addresses all the questions that I can see, unless I'm scrolling up and down, but I'll just pause for a second. And if anyone wants to raise their hand and unmute and actually ask a question, we'll take any of those now. We've got one hand. Chris, can you unmute Ian, please?
Hello, thank you. Sorry, it was just to kind of reiterate my point that I put in the chat, just because I'm going to be putting it in the consultation, and other institutions I'm supporting, I'm telling them to put it in the consultation, because I think my question is the year plus 14-day rule to kind of replace the year length of session year that was in place, so you can do everything you need to do with FTE and stu load? Yeah. So I think you can have institutions who all their undergrad will trigger that rule at least in year 1 to year 2. So it's going to become but slightly burdensome / is there much point to it when we're having to apply tolerance for such a huge chunk of the population? I can't think of institutions. I'm trying to think of any institutions I know of where it wouldn't affect. If you've got a big chunky full-time standard student undergrad September population, you're going to get a lot. I think you're going to get a lot more that will need tolerance than you might realise, because I just think that's normal to us. Whereas part of the problem with session year, forcing it to be 12 months, that was very abnormal to what really happens. The year plus 14 days is still abnormal to what really happens.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Thank you, Ian. And yes, please do encourage other providers and anyone else on here that that might apply to. If you put that in your consultation responses, we'll make sure we go through each of those, and then we make an assessment whether that is the vast majority of people, and come back to you on that. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Rachel.
I think we're done then, Ruth. I think back over to you for proposal 2.
Great, thank you, Rachel. So proposal number 2. This is around the return of previous student course sessions, and applies to 2 different scenarios that I'll run through, where the current guidance requires the return of a new student course session to record something. We're proposing that it changes to re-return the previous student course session to update information. We're proposing this because the current guidance, again, it was an area we got quite a lot of feedback on. The need to return those new student course sessions where there have been no activity means that there are dates being returned and student course sessions being returned that don't reflect activity or what you're holding in your systems. So that's why we've looked at this proposal to allow that return of the previous student course session in these 2 scenarios. So I'll run through the 2 scenarios. The first one relates to dormancy. So in this scenario, we've got a student who was expected to return, but subsequently takes a break in learning. As I said, the current guidance, if you didn't know that they were going dormant at the time you submitted when you're expecting them to return, you'd have to return a new student course session to record that session status update. But we're proposing that you would return the previous student course session again to record that. So to put that in hopefully a more helpful example, if we had a student who started study, sorry, Rachel, can we go on to the next slide? Thank you. Student who starts study in September 2024, they complete their first year as expected and are expected to return. So in 24056, they'd have student course session 1. with the start and end date for their first year, and no session status, because at the point that you submitted that to us, you were expecting them to come back for year 2. At some point in between you submitting that and their second year, they take an agreed break in learning. So in 25056, what we're proposing is that you'd have that same student course session returned again, so the same ID and the same dates, this time with a session status update, status change to dormant, with a date indicating that they went dormant after the end of the student course session, rather than having to return a new student course session to record that. The second scenario relates to Northern Irish providers only. This is because it relates to the module results field. That's only applicable to apprenticeship students in Northern Ireland. We did discuss whether it also applies to the module outcome field, but because that relates to completion rather than results, we think this example only applies to the module result field. And it's essentially the same principle. If you have a student who completed a student course session with unknown module results at the point that you submitted it, current guidance states that you would need to return the results against a new student course session. This proposal is that you would re-return the previous one. So again, applying that to a specific example, if the student completes their first year of study, again starting in September 24, in 24056, they'd have student course session 1 with a module instance, an outcome of 05, which indicates that the result is not yet known, and no module result would be returned at that point. And then in 25056, rather than returning a new student course session to record that module outcome, you'd see the same student course session returned again with the same module instance and the module outcome and result fields updated to reflect the result that you now know for that student, for that module. So that is what we're proposing for that one. There are some validation considerations here. So in these scenarios, we're only expecting the session status and or the module result fields to change. We wouldn't expect anything else on the student course session to be changing, because that's activity that happened in the previous year, so it shouldn't be updated, and it's likely that we'll have some validation in place to highlight if other fields have changed, as that's not what we're expecting. We're making a distinction here between updates and corrections. So in both of these examples, you're making an update to data that was previously unknown. So you couldn't tell us the student was going dormant because you didn't know, and now you do, so you're updating us. Whereas if something was previously incorrect, that's a different scenario, and that should be kind of raised with your funder and regulator. So we're not expecting to see this being used to kind of make corrections to previous data. In terms of the feedback we're after on this one, again, we're interested in, do you agree with this proposal? Or do you have any comments or alternative suggestions? We're also interested in here, and if you have any other scenarios where you think that guidance should apply. So we've suggested those 2 scenarios on dormancy and module results. But if you have any others where you think the similar guidance should be applicable, then you can include that in the consultation as well. And again, we're asking a question on timescales. So we're proposing to make this change for 24056, and we'd like your feedback on that. So I will throw back over to Rachel to see if we've got any questions to go through.
Yes, we do. So I'll start with software suppliers. There's a couple of questions come through around whether we've had discussions with software suppliers around this. And I'll be completely honest, I think I forgot to share that on the chat last week, so I will do that now. We have regular monthly meetings with them, so we will be talking through with them, and they can also respond to this consultation, and they should be on our mailing list. So hopefully most of them are already aware, but we will make sure that we note to have a specific consultation with them. I do note that some of you are putting in there that sometimes these proposals look like they might be difficult for software suppliers based on your experience from last year, so we will pick those points up with the various software suppliers on that. Okay, other questions. There's one come in from Kyla. I don't know if you're willing to unmute about whether this is for end of year return model or the in-year model that you're currently following. I'm not sure I fully understand what your question is there, because I think we've only got the annual model that you're returning now. So I don't know if you're willing to raise your hand so we can unmute you to explain. Otherwise, I'll pick that up with you afterwards. Yeah, there we go. Chris, do you mind unmuting Kyla?
Sorry, my dogs had just kicked off. No,
Perfect
so obviously Data Futures, the vision is it's in year. So I can see how this concept would work in year, because you can then in the second reference period state, oh, this student's gone dormant. What I'm not gathering is how we do it in an end of year return, much like I asked about your software suppliers, and someone's also mentioned with Tribal. That won't work with software currently, because everything's based on dates in session years. So if we're trying to return an historic stage, it's not going to be captured. So okay. This really needs to be talked through with software suppliers before it could be implemented. So we're currently Unit E and we are moving into 6. And I know both of those won't do this.
Okay, that's worth thank you, Kyla, for that. We will pick that up. On your point around in-year and end of year, we are keeping going with making this model in year until we have a decision about when that's falling. So that's why this is written with that in mind. I appreciate that doesn't really help you though. So we will pick that up with people after this call then. Thank you. Okay, I think those are all the questions, but there are other bits in the chat. Sorry, I just need to quickly read over them. So one question here around, would the dormant from date need to be inside the original or previous student course session year? So in the dormant example, I think, Ruth, that's a yes, isn't it? Because the point is you're returning something that you didn't know happened, but actually did then happen, and that would then fall within the student course session.
It would need to reflect the date on which the student went dormant. So it would be, in this example, in a previous reference period, and it would be like the day after the end of the student course session to say that's when they went dormant from.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So another question. Does the session status entity need to be a sub-entity of student course session? So we did look around moving it to potentially engagement, because I think there was a bit of feedback in terms of, oh, that's what you said. Yep, could be that. So we did look at that, and I think there was an example where that actually makes something slightly more difficult. So we've left it on student course session at the moment. If others believe that it would be different, again, please put that in the consultation and we can have another look at that. It was around trying to making sure that it was very clear at what point in their study that thing is happening, whereas on engagement it could get a little bit confusing in terms of if they need to do multiple times of the session status. So yeah, again, that's where we got to, because we thought that looked like the appropriate thing, but if you believe not, then do put that in the consultation. What ones we got? So if the previous student course session was down as completed, would we have to specify the dormancy starts and date after the end date, or could a simple flag and the date be derived afterwards? I'm actually not sure of the answer in this one, Ruth. I don't know if we looked at flags for the dormancy one. Do you have any ideas on this one?
I don't think we specifically looked at that. I think the reason we've got the session status date specifically in there is that there will be cases where we won't be able to derive that. I appreciate in the example we showed here, we know it was after the end of the student course session, but there are cases where it could be during a student course session. And then that's used in some of our population definitions if we know when the student's gone dormant. So we can take it away and include it in the consultation. I'm thinking we may not be able to derive that in every case, but we can consider it.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, a couple left there then. So would we have to return all of the child entities when you're returning the student course session? So things like module instance or off venue activity, when you're re-returning it to update, say the dormancy example? Yes, I think that is true. I think one of the validation rules Ruth talked about was around making sure nothing else had changed in that, and there wouldn't be a way for us to make sure that that validation was there without asking for those things to be returned again. So I'm afraid the answer to that one is yes, it would be a case of re-returning. That's, I guess, one of the questions, is that more or less burdensome than returning what is the kind of the fake student course session, as I saw some of the feedback in there in the first consultation. Is that more or less burdensome than that? So yeah, that's where the proposal is, and you tell us whether or not that's going to work for you. And then final question I've got here, unless anyone adds their hand up, would a provider have the choice of how to return these dormant scenarios? So the old way or the new way? I'm not sure we've been explicit with this, actually. I think the ideal would be that everyone does them in the same way, but if it's about re-returning an old one, I'm not sure that we necessarily need to completely exclude that. So if that's something you'd like to do, it'd be really helpful to have in the consultation, and we can take that to statutory customers to see whether you can have the choice of doing that. Oh, and we've got one more come in. Sorry, I'll just do one more and then we'll leave it there and move on to the next proposal. In the new dormancy scenario, if combined with the removal of session year and forcing student course sessions to be a year long, which is correct, would the dormant from date be after the student course session year finishes or after the end of the planned activity within that year, as per the current guidance? So I think it's when the planned activity ends, so it's when the student themselves would have gone dormant. It doesn't have to be after that student course session. I think that's the right answer, but please correct me if I've said the wrong answer there.
No, that's right. We want that date to reflect the end of the activity. So genuinely when the student went dormant. Just to clarify on the previous point about student course sessions being a year long, that would be the case in lots of scenarios. As we said, there are some exceptions to that. And again, I'd suggest having a look at the draft guidance in the consultation. For example, if you had a September starter studying from September to June, your student course session could be September to June. It wouldn't have to be like session years now, September to September. But have a look at the examples, and then let us know if you're unsure about what we're proposing there.
Okay, I think we'll move to the next proposal then. We can try and answer any leftover questions at the end, or we'll send it to you afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Proposal 3. This relates to module instance dates. So the current guidance, module instances must be contained within the associated student course session. So if a student's activity spans on that module spans between student course sessions, you have to return 2 module instances and essentially kind of chop that activity down the middle to record the start of their module against one student course session and the end of that study on the module against the second student course session. This, again, was an area where we've received feedback that this was a challenging approach because that start and end dates in the middle of that module activity don't relate to the student's activity or a date that you would have internally. So it was challenging to have to create those dates. This is also an area module dates are used by HEFCU in their funding model, and they've indicated their preference would be also to have allowing these dates to span between student course sessions where applicable so that they can more easily identify when the modules start and end. So based on the feedback from providers and with statutory customers, we're proposing to update that module instance date guidance to allow these to span student course sessions. And I'll just talk that through on the next couple of slides with a visual, hopefully make that clearer what we're proposing here. So this is the current guidance. If we had student course session 1 and student course session 2 representing 2 years of the student's study, and then the student's activity on the module spanned between those 2 student course sessions. In the current guidance, you'd have 1 module instance returned against student course session 1. The start date would reflect the start date of that module, and the end date would have to align with the student course session end date to make sure it's contained within that student course session. Then you'd need a second module instance returned against student course session 2. The start date would align with the student course session start date, and then the end date would indicate when they finish study on that module. So it's that module instance 1 end date and module instance 2 start date that we have feedback on were kind of challenging to return because they don't reflect the student's activity on that module. So what we're proposing then is that you don't have to amend those dates so that they are contained within the student course session it's associated with. So in the proposed guidance, student course session 1 would still have a module instance with a start date reflecting when the student started studying on that module, but the end date would be null because they haven't completed that module yet, and that would be in line with some of our guidance on other end dates, that they're not returned until that activity has ended. Student course session 2 would then have module instance 1 returned again with the same start date. So that start date would be prior to the student course session start date, and the end date reflecting when the student finished study on that module. So key thing to note here, you would still have to return module instance against both student course sessions because the student studied that module in both student course sessions, but you'd no longer need to chop it in half with the dates to contain them within those associated student course sessions. And there would be no end date returned in the first one because it hasn't finished yet. In terms of other considerations on this, could go on to the next slide, thank you. So within the consultation, you've got draft guidance for the module instance start and end date fields that you can have a look at. That's what we're proposing. We're also proposing that if this was implemented, the continuing field could be removed as it would no longer be required. So in that example, the module instance field, module instance continuing fields would currently be returned against the second module instance to tell us that it was continuing from the previous student course session. That would no longer be required because we could tell that from the start date. We would need to update the validation. At the moment, the validation doesn't allow the return of this, so we would need to update it to allow module instance dates outside the student course session. And we'd also need to consider continuity validation. So again, in that example, we had a module instance against student course session 1 without an end date. So we'd probably expect to see that module instance again in student course session 2 to show that it ended. So feedback on this one, there's the two kind of recurring questions here to note. So again, we're asking for feedback on your proposal. Do you agree with that proposal? Are there any other suggestions you'd like to raise? And then again, timescales. So we're proposing for 24056, but we'd like your feedback on that. So I'll pause again and see if we've had any questions.
Yeah, we've got a couple. Ian, I'm not sure if you're willing to unmute. I'm not sure I quite follow which slide you wrote your question on. So the question was, what would the student course session ID look like on that module, which I presume is this page you were referring to. But if you're willing to, yeah, you're there.
Always willing to unmute, you know me. Yeah, so in for student course session 1, say the SES session ID was 1. So sorry, it's my first day back off holiday and I think my brain's a bit foggy. Do we not link module instance to student course session via session ID?
Yeah, so it's underneath the student course session. So I think the module instance 1 on there would start off with the first student course session ID because that's where it would be returned. And then when you move into the second student course session, you could change the ID to then refer to that. But I mean, in effect, you're returning another version of that entity, but then with the end date on. So I think that was my understanding. But Ruth, tell me if I'm wrong. I think it's student course session 1 for the first time it comes, and then student course session 2 for the second one.
Yeah, so module instance is the child of student course session, and the student course session ID is part of the primary key for the module instance. It's part of what uniquely identifies the module instance. So I've got on this slide module instance 1, module instance 1. They would in reality have different IDs because they're associated with different student course sessions. So I think for any kind of validation or tracking, we probably have to look at the module ID that they're linked to rather than the module instance ID.
Okay, yeah, I think that's how are you going to know that? Yeah, I think that's what I was wondering. How are you going to know that it's the same module? Yeah, I think you've just answered my question, so I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
I think what we'll do though, Ian, is we'll add the student course session ID onto the guidance page actually, because I think that's a good point. People might not pick that up instantly.
And I think software suppliers, SITs will definitely, Tribal will definitely need to know about that because of how SCS session IDs generate.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's only one more question at the moment, and this one is going to go across to our statutory customers who are here. So the question, if HEFQ is the only funding body using module dates for funding purposes, why do providers outside of Wales have to report module dates? So I don't know if Alan or Gordon from OFS or SFC, whether there's anything you want to add on here. When we were talking about it, HEFQ are definitely using it in their funding model, but that isn't the only use for it in terms of understanding when people are studying. But I'll hand over to you two in case you've got anything to add. Alan, should we go to you first?
Again, that's one I'll have to take away to seek the advice from colleagues on.
Gordon, is there anything you want to add? Oh, Gordon, I don't think you're unmuted, sorry.
Apologies, Michael. We use the information to get a split by module and cost centre so that we know what price groups activity are taking place in. So although we don't use it specifically to drive funding, we use it to monitor how our places are being used in terms of splits by price groups, and that might possibly lead to changes in splits of allocations by price groups going forward. So although it doesn't drive it from year to year, it may lead to differences in the way we allocate places in future.
Thank you, Gordon. I think those are all the questions relating to the module proposal, but I'll just pause in case anyone wants to raise their hand and ask any other questions. Okay. Oh, sorry, we've got one. Karen, do you want to come in? Chris, are you able to unmute Karen?
Yeah, she's unmuted.
Can't hear you, Karen.
Karen, you need to manually unmute. I've allowed your mic, so you need to manually unmute yourself.
Sorry, that's my fault. Apologies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that. So when you're talking about calculating price groups, aren't price groups calculated by course HECOS codes now and not module cost centre?
Is that question to Gordon? Sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
Price groups are calculated by module cost centre, not HECOS.
I think we've got that question from an English provider. It might be different in Scotland. So I think you're right, Karen, in England.
Yeah.
Obviously, Gordon's commenting on Scotland. I know that we also use the module dates in our calculation of cost centre FTE our side. But yeah, I think we can take it away and get some more information.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all the questions to this one. So I think we'll go to the next proposal, Ruth.
Thanks, Rachel. So the final one is about what we call accumulating student course session sub-entities. So this relates to the current guidance we have that states that if a student course session spans reference periods, then for these three entities that this proposal relates to, they must all be returned in the final reference period the student course session spans, even if they finished in a previous reference period. So if you had a student course session going from reference period 1 to 2 and a module instance finished in reference period 1, it would still have to be returned in reference period 2 against that student course session. So this is an area, again, we got a lot of feedback on. It was resulting in quite large volumes of data having to be returned when it was felt that that wasn't necessary and shouldn't be required. So this change proposes that we would only be required to return those entities in the reference periods they span. And just for clarity, as it says on the slide there, this refers to the module instance, off-venue activity and session status entities. These are the ones that are within a student course session time bound. So a student could finish a module instance or an off-venue activity in one reference period. There are other sub-entities of student course session that apply to the full student course session. So something like study location is looking at the proportion over the full student course session. So this guidance doesn't apply to those entities, it's just these three. So again, a little bit of a visual to hopefully demonstrate what we mean here. So if we've got the 24056 reference period and the 25056 reference period, and one student course session that runs from January to December 2025, so it spans those two reference periods. And then for the purpose of this example, it's got 3 module instances. Module instance 1 is contained within 24056. Module instance 2 spans them both, and module instance 3 is contained within 25056. So in terms of what you would return in 24056, there's no change to that based on this proposal. You would have to return module instance 1 and module instance 2 because they overlap with the 24056 reference period. So this proposal wouldn't change in this scenario what you'd return in 24056. The difference would be in 25056. So based on the current guidance, you'd have to return all 3 of those modules. As I said, the current guidance is that those entities are accumulated, and in the final reference period, the student course session spans, you have to return them all. So you'd return module instances 1, 2, and 3 in 25056. In the proposed guidance, you would just return module instances 2 and 3 in this example. As I said, we're proposing that you only need to return the module instances in the reference periods they span. So module instance 1 finished in the 24056 reference period, it would not need to be returned again in 25056. So the difference here is that module instance 1 in the current guidance would be returned again. In the proposed guidance, it would not need to be returned again. So for this example, we focused on module instances. But again, this also applies to off-venue activity and session status entities. In terms of any other considerations on this proposal, the reason that the current guidance was drafted as it is that would allow entities previously returned in error to be removed. So in that example on the previous slide, module instance 1 was fully contained in 24056. If that was returned in that reference period in error, based on the current guidance, it could be removed in 25056, and we would take that as a correction that module had been returned in error. Under the new guidance, it wouldn't be returned at all, so there would be no way to indicate that. We would also need to update validation to make sure that we were accounting for this, as the validation at the moment requires the re-returning of those entities. So we'd need to update it to account for that. So the feedback that we want on this one, again, the standard kind of questions. Do you agree with that proposal? Are there any alternatives you want us to consider? Also interested in your views here on that intention of the guidance. So that idea that the current guidance allows you to correct previously incorrect data. Is that necessary? And also for that, if you could bear in mind the potential of moving to in-year. I think when the timescales get more compressed, it may be that this is more relevant. So we're interested in your views in if that is necessary. And again, on the timescales, so we're proposing for 24056, but we'd like your feedback on that. So just before we go to questions, I'll just do the last slide because there's only one left as a bit of a summary, and then we'll open out again to questions. So as I've gone through, there are 4 proposals within the consultation. We've based these on the feedback from yourselves through the collection and through our post-collection surveys and seminars. And then through conversations with statutory customers, we've developed those 4 proposals. We'd like feedback on the proposals themselves and also, as I've said, the timescales for implementation. So you can treat those questions separately. It might be that you're really pro one of the proposals, but think that 24056 is not realistic. So yeah, please answer those kind of separately and we can take that into account. We're asking for responses by the 5th of July. And as Rachel said at the start, following that, we're aiming to publish a summary of the responses and updated notification of changes for 24056 by the end of August. So that is all the slides that I was going to run through. I will ask Rachel again if we've had any more questions to pick up.
Yes, we have had a couple, and then lots of comments flooding in right now. So keeping back on proposal 4, I'll just go back one so we remember where we are. Proposal 4, so if that goes ahead, but we still return those entities that finish in the first reference period, would this constitute an error, or would we have an option of kind of doing, again, the old versus new way that came up in the other one? So would you be allowed to return that even if you didn't have to return that? I think, Ruth, the answer to that is we haven't actually considered that both options, have we? We've only been looking at the new proposal, so that's something we'll have to take away and just double check, but I can't see any reason why we wouldn't allow you to do that.
Yeah, I think we just have to consider consistency across providers and being able to tell the difference between a student retaking a module and a module being re-returned. But I would have thought we could do that with the IDs. So yeah, we can take it away, but we'll just have to make sure that we can account for that.
Okay, oh, sorry, another comment, sorry, is the same one, asking the same question, basically. Can you return them outside of what we've just said in there? So that's okay. Another comment then around will there be any validation that looked back at the previous return child entities and compared those to the ones being returned for the current reference period? And yes, I think is the example for that one. Ruth mentioned there's bits in there in terms of keeping the continuity returned. So we will be checking between what you had returned previously and what is now. And only those items that we're saying is okay to return will be allowed through. And if not, then they will be kind of triggered and asked for an explanation to check that they are correctly changed. Another question then, would HESA be willing to provide some examples as to what is considered an off-venue activity? It's not quite the proposal here, but definitely a question that's been raised before, so happy to answer it. Yes, so we are trying to work through from the suggestions that were raised in the consultation, the specific areas, and off-venue activity is definitely one that came up that you want more guidance on. Yes, right now I haven't got any written, but it is definitely on liaison's list to kind of write some more examples in there. And I think particularly people have asked for having a better understanding of when you do and don't return things. So not just what would be counted, but when does the 20-day rule apply and things like that. We did have a nice flowchart diagram. I don't know if people use that these days, but it might be worth us updating things like that to help with those decisions as well. So yes, we will come back to that. If there are specific ones that you're not sure of, always drop liaison an email and we can look at your individual cases. Okay, while I've been answering questions, more stuff has come in. Comments here around feedback from software suppliers again, and whether or not they're going to be able to make the changes in time. I will add that to our list then to pick up with software suppliers. We have had conversations previously about the lead time needed, and with this consultation we've been really stretched to try and get enough work done to be sure that the proposals are valid ones that we're putting forward. So that's why this deadline is just coming a bit closer, but we will pick that up with it and make sure that we've found out when everyone's kind of dates are for releasing things. Another question on here then, could you show us where in the current guidance it says that module instance not in the student course session or reporting year of the current return still needs to be returned? I am not sure where that guidance is. I will be honest with you, Ellie, I think is reporting that. I don't know if you want to put your hand up and just help us understand where that's coming from in this. Only module instances that are underneath the student course session you're putting in, so are fitting within those dates, are the ones that would be returned here. I don't think you need to be returning things that are outside of that. Thank you, Ellie. If you don't mind unmuting her, Chris.
Just one moment. All right, you're muted. Just manually unmute yourself. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So it was just the example you showed. The module 1 wasn't in the student course session that was being returned in 25056 at all, right? So
that one on the slide now, Ellie.
yeah.
So some of the dates are within the student course session. So it's not just about the whole module being contained. Part of it is being studied in that student course session, and that's why it falls into scope.
In the
I think it might be just.
sorry. I think this is a confusing picture. I thought it was.
It is hard to diagram. Yeah, it is hard to diagram some of these things. We kind of need a 3D diagram of like when the module was actually studied and when the bits are that you're returning against the student course session, but I've yet to find a way of doing that nicely. So yeah.
Okay, for you, because I also saw a question in the Q&A that someone else was asking about, and it sounded like they were having problems because they weren't returning things that were not in the current student course session. So I thought maybe that was something, and I just hadn't, I've read it wrong until now. So that was why. But obviously that's not. It must be something else.
Yeah, that might be. I think Kyla, you are the one who asked that question in the Q&A. I don't know if Chris, you could unmute Kyla. You might be able to help with where your question came from on this.
Hi, yes. Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously historically we had mod stat 4 that indicated that module didn't contribute in that reporting year. And now when we were designing all the reports to extract for data futures, we stopped pulling modules that sat outside of the student course session. So if you imagine a long postgraduate taught, all the modules were done in the previous reporting period, and the only one that spans is the dissertation. So we're only returning the dissertation module. And as I've stated, we're triggering 191,000 errors by doing this. So what we're saying is, regardless of when the module was studied, you return it in every SCS for the whole engagement.
No, sorry, I think this might just be a confusing diagram. So just to clarify, you only need to return it in the student course sessions that module instance spans. It's just that the current guidance will also require you to return it in some cases where it occurred in a previous student course session. So you definitely don't need to return, say, a module instance that happened in student course session 1 in student course session 3 for the whole engagement, only the ones that span that student course session.
Okay, I'm going to have to get my head around these 191,000 errors. Okay.
Yeah, get in touch if that's confusing, if the error seems contradictory.
Okay.
We can have a look at them.
And I'm just going to ask Ian, you said you wanted to come in on that question, which I think we've answered now, but do you want to raise your hand if there's anything else you want to add on to that point? Yes, you are there.
Hello. Just on top of what Ellie and Kyla's just said, because I know a couple of other institutions who's got a massive figure, I'm guessing is on the same error that Kyla's facing. Is the question not more about if we've got a spanning student course session from 23056 into 23056 and say there were 3 modules, if module 1, I don't know if it's better on the. Have you got a previous slide to that? That's the current situation.
Yeah, I think we've got.
Right. So I thought there was guide. Oh no, that's the proposal. I thought there was guidance that if we're returning a student course session again this year, we not only have to report the module instances for the activity that's happening this year, but if there was a module instance that started and ended in the previous reference period on that same student course session, even if it's not changed, that has to be returned again.
Yeah, that is the current one. Yeah, so
right. So
we
I
call it kind of accumulating entities. Yeah.
I thought that's what Ellie's original question was about, because I think the guidance that explicitly states that's buried somewhere as well. So your proposal is actually removing the necessity to actually do that.
Yeah, that's right. So in this example, I think what we're talking about is relating to module instance 1 here, where at the moment you'd have to return that in a second reference period. Proposal is that you wouldn't. I think there was some confusion about re-returning ones from a previous student course session, which is not a requirement. It is in the guidance. I'd have to to find a link to it. I'm not sure off the top of my head where exactly it is, but it is in there.
Yeah, Helen's just said Helen, I don't think it was just a transition year requirement. I think it's a requirement for this year as well.
Yeah, that's true.
It's
not just transition.
We did have some slightly different guidance for the transition year, just because for some of these entities, if that activity took place during the 21 reporting year, you might not have had the data in the right format. So it was actually it was a requirement that was not required in 22056.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. Yeah.
But is in 23056.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. Okay.
Sorry, Rachel, one more thing. I think this rule that people are commenting on, module instance 6, there is a known issue with that rule. We have temporarily removed it from the collection because a lot of you were hitting it for a large number of errors. So apologies for the confusion on that one. We'll get it on the known issues, and your next file, it shouldn't trigger. We've removed it while we fix it.
Thanks, Ruth. I was about to come to that question, so good timing. Okay, so I think there's one other that doesn't cross over with things we've already kind of mentioned, and that is a concern generally about the amount of change happening in the record. So quoting, the 25-26 is expanding to include UK partnerships for England and Wales, and the transnational education outcomes are falling into 26-27. And so, just being concerned around the number of changes that are coming. Absolutely agree with that. We're also considering what may or may not happen in terms of LLE, and that when that will fall into making changes for the record, we're trying to keep updated with progress there. So yes, absolutely a concern in terms of number of changes. There's not an awful lot I can say about that. I'm mentioning the TNE stuff and the LLE stuff. I think they are now both delayed with their announcements because of the pre-election period. So I can't say an awful lot about that at the moment, but definitely that there is, appreciate that there is concerns there around the number of changes we've got now. Okay, I think that addresses all of the Q&A questions that we've had. I think a couple of new ones that are coming are related to ones we've already mentioned, so we will pick them up specifically later. There are other bits in the chats, but I'm going to suggest we deal with more of those afterwards. It might be easier to make sure we've responded to each of you individually. So I think we're coming to a close here. So are there any other questions people want to raise their hand to answer? Otherwise, we will start to draw to a close. I think there's one hand up.
Yeah, there's. Do you want me to allow the mic?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm not sure who it is, but it says T. I have allowed your mic. You can manually unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hello there.
Oh, okay. Hi, Tracy. I just wanted to ask, based on the module date, and the gentleman was saying about it being used for cost centre in Wales, and the other gentleman saying he'd have to go back for feedback as to why we're using it in England. Could we not propose that the module dates is only required for Wales?
Can certainly take it as feedback, but I think there are uses in some of the other countries. They're just not necessarily bringing the answers today. So we will ask the questions and share the responses later. And if not, then please do include that proposal in the consultation response.
I will include it in the consultation response. And if we keep it, I'd really like to know what other reasons we are requiring this data.
Yep, noted. We'll add that one on.
All right, cheers. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much, Tracy. I think that is all the hands I can see. I think we'll stop there then. Ruth, is there anything else you want to add? Or we're doing the last few slides, I think, aren't we?
Yeah, if you jump to the feedback slides, I'll hand back over to Chris just to close off the session. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, so just before you all leave, can I just ask that you please complete the feedback? We're very, thankful for the time you spent here today, but we also want to know how you enjoyed the session. So please feel free to complete this feedback. I would pop in the link now to the chat, so to make it easier for you. And just something to make note of, when you try to complete this feedback, I have put a section that says 24056 consultation. Please click on that section when you get to the part that says what was the topic or focus of your training. And the reason for that is so that we can streamline the different, because this is the same feedback form for every other record. So this would help us align basically your feedback for this particular section to this to that particular line. Okay. So we do take note of every feedback, and we will definitely use that to improve our training service in subsequent training. Okay. Next slide. And just a very big thank you from myself and everyone who has presented today, Ruth, Rachel, and every statutory customer that's actually represented here today. I do hope you enjoyed today's session and have a lovely evening, okay? And just lastly, we do have the liaison email here, and we have the training email. So if you do need any extra support, please feel free to contact the liaison team or feel free to contact the training team for any additional training services, okay? Last slide, is there anything on there? Okay, and this is just the general disclaimer. You do have copies of this presentation, so please feel free to read through, okay? And that being said, thank you everyone and have a lovely evening. We're going to keep the session on to 4:30 just in case you want to drop any questions, but if you do not have anything, feel free to leave and we'll see you when we can. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello. I was just listening to the final goodbyes of the meeting.
Didn't you hear that well? I think it's safe to say we can end the meeting now, yeah? All right, so I'll end the meeting now. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.